Welcome everyone. My name is achekulaev. I work for it as a technical analyst, and I'm one of maintainers of the Docksal project. This is a tool that I'm going to speak about today, and hopefully this tool will help you to save a bunch of time and nerves with your local environments, and hopefully even more. Some of you may have used Docksal or use it right now. Others don't know what it is about. So I have to always take this step back and talk about why we even got there. And we got there because of this. Because this is how it starts. And cannot reproduce is the most annoying thing you can hear from your teammates. And get me right, if you're a sole Drupal developer and you don't have any team to share your code with, it does not really matter which local environment you use, whether it's MAMP, whether it's XAMPP, whether it's just regular Apache built into your operating system, whether it's macOS or Linux. But when you get the team, you get into cannot reproduce field. Sooner or later, especially with junior developers, from my experience, it's junior developers who actually consume the majority of time struggling with the issue. What do? Of course, you have to unify your environment. Everyone comes to that decision sooner or later that you want to unify your environment this or that way. And usually, I don't want to speculate these are the only ways to do that, but these are definitely mainstream ways to do that nowadays, Docker or Vagrant. And I don't really want to get into too much deep into the rabbit hole, which one is better, which one is worse, what is better for what. There is actually a separate talk about that from Leonid Makarov. There's a link on top of this slide. It's called Why Docker Better Than VMs. It deep dives into this rabbit hole. But I won't do this for this talk. Just say that we chose Docker, not Vagrant. And main reasons for that is that when you have many projects, Docker is more efficient than Vagrant. Vagrant machines, or virtual machines in general, are pretty expensive when you launch them. And this is an architectural, I cannot say it's flaw, but it's a specific, architectural specific. It provisions at the runtime, so you have the base box and a lot of automation that runs when you start the machine. And it takes time, it takes a lot of resources. And when you have several projects, you have to stop and start them all the time, which is annoying. While Docker containers are start and stop within seconds, so it's much more efficient when you have a lot of projects. Also, this provisioning at runtime it's another drawback, is that it can break, and often does. It's not only it can break, it does break after a certain amount of time. You need to maintain that. While with Docker images, it's much more stable, not as fragile. That automation, not as fragile. Those Docker images are pre-compiled. You download them, you run them, and they run. And you would imagine it's because of that provisioning at the runtime, it would be easier to extend VM, but ironically it's not, because that automation is pretty complex. And for your local environment, you don't actually want to spend hours struggling with your infrastructure. You just want to start pre-project and start Drupaling. And with those precompiled, baked-in images, provided you have additional flexibility, it's actually easier to do that with those kinda, you might think, unflexible images, which is not true, by the way, but we'll come back to it later. It's easier to extend, it's easier to hack around for your local environment. And last but not least, containers are more portable than VMs. And for the sake of this presentation, we'll look at the CI perspective of reusing those containers. While running, if you imagine if you have Vagrant machine, running it in the CI environment would be a stretch. So okay, we chose Docker, but how did we get from Docker to Docksal? This is another line of events I'd like to speak a little bit about, because Docker, while being a very powerful tool for enterprise, it's not really friendly if you want to do a local environment development, because commands are lengthy, you need to know what you're doing, and that's why Docker Compose evolved, right? Because people wanted to do things faster and easier. And some people do use Docker Compose at their local, but still, it's not as flexible as you would want it to be. For your local, you just want to develop. You just want environment to work. Just start for me and work. I just want to do my code development. I don't want to dig into environment too much. And with Docker Compose, you would still have to replicate, to copy paste a lot of code, to know what you're doing. And it's not really OS independent Docker Compose files. That's why we got to the Docksal phase. It's Docker Compose plus several Docksal branded container Docker images and containers, plus some conventions. And I wanted to highlight that the compose part. So compose means that it's literally compose. Docksal YAML, which is the configuration for your environment, is Docker Compose file. You do not need to learn new YAML dialect like some other solutions which are based on Docker force you to. Because you need to, with them, you need to learn new dialect, how they do things, and to understand how they do things before diving into your local environment. With Docksal, you don't need to, because Docksal YAML is definitely fully Docker Compose compatible, but it has some predefined variables, some predefined conventions where files are located. It has some predefined stacks, so-called, so default YAML files that you can build on top of. So, and because of that, for your local, you sometimes don't even need this file. You can omit it. What about those Docksal branded containers? So there's three main services. First is CLI. It provides PHP, and it serves as the main point of interaction between user and your environment. So the central utility of Docksal is called Fin. So when you launch Fin Bash, which is an interactive shell into your local environment, in your project environment, you're actually interacting with CLI. Web is obviously a web server, Apache 2.2 or 2.4, and database is MySQL database. And you can see that each of them provides actually several versions of software, right? PHP 5.6, 7.0, 7.1, you can choose them. And you might ask, like, isn't it the same inconsistency hell that we actually talked about to begin with, right? We wanted to avoid inconsistency hell, but you still have a lot of versions. How do you, so how did you avoid it? So the thing is, while you still have choices, you can actually bake in those choices into your code, into your project code. So everyone working on the same project will work with the same versions, with the same software versions, and have the same environment. So there won't be inconsistency hell within a single project. That's how you achieve it, and that's how you resolve it. There's more additional stock services that we provide, Solar and Varnish, but that does not mean this limits you to the amount of services that you have. There are more. You do not have to use Docksal branded containers within your project. If you dive into documentation on Docksal, you can actually find how to use stock Memcache container to add Memcache service to your project, or Mailhawk, and many others. And I will get to that on the next slide, but there is a lot of freedom you have to hack your environment with Docksal. And on here, I would also want to talk a little bit about boilerplates. So we have a lot of boilerplates for modern CMSs like Drupal, WordPress, Magento, Laravel, and even JS-oriented ones. So those are Node.js showing you that Docksal is not only LAMP stack, you can actually use it for Node.js stack or any stack you need to, because of that flexibility we'll talk about later. And those boilerplates are almost literally at your fingertips. You can run project create command, and there's going to be a wizard that asks you what project to create. What it means for you is that, let's say you want to bootstrap a new Drupal 8 project. Instead of going to Drupal.org or copying your old project, you can start with project create and have just vanilla Drupal installed within a matter of seconds pretty easily. Or you want it always to try Magento, let's say. Magento setup or even Laravel setup is non-trivial thing. It can take you literally an hour to set up that CMS. I tried that from the ground up. With Project Create, you can have it, again, running within minutes easily to try them out, to see what they do, without having to deep dive into documentation, how to set them up. And now back to the flexibility that you have. So we all love Drupal because you can plug into so many parts. There are so many hooks that you can plug into almost any life cycle of the project. Before menu renders, after menu renders, before page renders, after page renders. You can hack it in so many ways. And that's how we wanted our local environment to function, because you don't want to be limited in what you do. That's why you can create automation, let's say in Bash Node or PHP. Bash because the environment is unified. You will have Bash even on Windows because you will need to install a Baboon. It's a Cygwin implementation of Bash for Windows, one of them. Or you can install actually Ubuntu services for Linux. Linux services for Windows, Ubuntu, and use that one. And because we did not reinvent the wheel with YAML, you have the full power of Docker Compose to hack with your environment to add more services. People in the community often use this flexibility in the ways we never predicted. One guy worked on a government project and he figured out how to add a Kerberos authentication to a project, which I couldn't even think of. But he figured it out. He just added another container, added a couple of lines of automation, and he was fine. All his projects could benefit from that. You can imagine if you had to explain your junior developers how to set that by some documentation that you would create. Those Docker images that you provide, if you remember, I was talking about them, right? There's three main. The thing is, you're not enclosed into them. You can break out. You can extend them simply with Docker files. So say you like something. You don't have some utility you need in command line for your automation. And you can just create a Docker file that will extend our image, put it into your project, and every time anyone starts your project, it will take our image, extend it with commands that you provided in Docker file, and you will have your custom image without any need to actually maintain it on Docker Hub. And last but not least, you can create and publish public add-ons in our repository. This is pretty democratic repository, and we try to accept a lot of functionality there. So if you think about an add-on that community can benefit from, let's say recently it was code style. Someone added a code style utility, and when it's published there, anyone can install it with add-on install command from the command line, and just an easy way to use community automation in your project. You might have noticed that I say automation a lot, because that's another half, or maybe even more than a half, of why we made Docksal. Not only to unify for unification, but unify because this is the only way you can actually create automation that will work across your whole team. Why write documentation when you can write code? We all love writing code. So the code, documentation is an instruction how to set up your environment and project. And probably everyone have been through that. You receive this 3-page, 200 lines, 15 items document on how to set up your environment, which files should put where, should be put where, what settings you should put. All those instructions can be code instructions, so why don't write code? Well, we all know why, because we don't have unified environment, but now we do. That's why you can automate all the things. And our dream was actually that a new developer, when it comes to a project, instead of getting this 3 or sometimes even more, 10 pages document on how to set up your environment, he or she gets a couple of lines of code he needs to run, or even does not get any instruction because he knows how to initialize a project. And this is what we wanted to have, and this is what we came to. You can create your custom automation commands for your project and put them into your project folder, and Fin, which is the command line utility of Docksal, will recognize those commands as its subcommands, so you can easily use them. And you just create this init script. This is an arbitrary name, but it's kinda became conventional name for for script that initializes your project. And you put your documentation, quote unquote, in this script in form of code. You can create the containers from there, run automation that you need for your project, initialize some settings, put them into files, import your database maybe, compile CSS. So basically when junior developers joins your project, what he needs to do is to install Docksal, get your project sources, run Fin init, and he's done. He don't need to read through 3 pages of documentation. He don't need to get back to team lead asking, I don't understand this line. He just runs the command and have the project running because the environment is unified. Some guys actually ask to automate even more. This assumes that you have your project running locally. Some guys wanted to automate without having project locally at all. Say you have a project that is Composer controlled, and you want to use Composer to create a project. That would create a dependency. You would need to ask your developers to install Composer locally. And it's not always what you want. That's why, and even if you ask them to install Composer locally, it can different versions. And you never know, different versions might pull different stuff or function differently. That's why in Docksal we have this run CLI command. What it does, it actually creates an ad hoc CLI container and runs commands that you runs those commands that you passed to this run CLI in that container. So you can say run CLI Composer create project without even having Composer installed. It will spawn this ad hoc on-demand CLI container, run Composer create project from it that will pull sources, run this whole Composer thing, and then container will collapse. You don't even need to think about it. So without having Composer installed, you'll have your sources, and after that you can run Fin init or whatever automation you have. And I strongly encourage you to use, even on the verge of using this automation, because when you start doing automation, it's hard to stop. You realize how many things you've been doing manually. And when you realize that every time you notice another thing you've been doing manually, you want to automate this. And you can. Like maybe you've been clearing not just Drupal cache, but some additional varnish cache. You have varnish in your project, and you want to clear Drupal cache and to clear varnish cache. And that's 2 commands. Why have 2 commands when you have 1 command? Create clear cache script, put clear Drupal cache and clear varnish cache in there, and run it within 1 command. Or maybe you have built theme that will run Babel, Webpack, or Compass, or Gulp, or all at once. Again, within one command. And what you can actually do is you can say for those scripts to run inside the CLI container, which is actually preferred way and more portable, because by default, these scripts that you create, then they run on the host. And while environment is unified as much as it could be unified, as it can be unified across the operating systems, there are still, this fundamental operating systems difference. Like Windows has its own file system and its own permissions. You cannot forget about it. But if you create, you can set an execution target to be the container, and the whole script will execute inside the container, and that's how you can use Node and PHP and know that they will always work, because they are inside the container. You know which container versions you use, you know which Node versions you use. You know that if you created the script once for the CLI version 2.1, it will work no matter what, because it will always run inside the container. Yeah, so again, create any automations. Maybe you need to collect minerals, whatever that means. It actually shows that you can use parameters, that automation is actually pretty rich. So whatever you pass to the command will get into that. You can process parameters, and you can create very rich automations. I have one specific for a project that does a lot of things. It's like a project within a project, but it's just implemented with Bash scripts. And you want to learn Bash, because if you don't, many things are automated with Bash. So it's not just Docksal, it's overall CI, wherever you go. Okay, now we'll get to the next part. We have all this. Let me go back. We have all this automation. We have all the unified environment, all the automation, all the initialization, which works great across the whole team, across the operating systems. But the best part is that you can reuse it even beyond your local environment. And in this case, I'm talking about sandboxes. This slide jumps a little bit ahead of time. Let's talk about what sandboxes are for. So sandboxes are temporary environments you create for your features that are in development, and you want to test them maybe, or demo them, or to run automated testing on them. And not many people use them, because I will not dress it up. Setting up continuous integration for sandboxes is hard. It is. You need to account for a lot of stuff. You need to bind several systems together, and for those several systems, there is some Linux server that will run those sandboxes, some CI solution that will react to your changes, and your Git repo, and you need to sync them all up. And Docksal helps you to ease some part of this pain, because it automates, again, automation everywhere, it automates some things for you. And I will show it on the example of CircleCI, how you can automate sandboxes creation for your project. I will not deep dive into every line. This is more a demonstration, a high-profile demonstration, what activities you should expect when you're set that you want sandboxes. If you decide, okay, I want sandboxes, then what would I need to do? What do I have to have? And this is what you have. This is what you need. Where you start with. You need to to have some dedicated server, no matter where. It can be AWS, it can be DigitalOcean, it can be your PC under your desk. Doesn't really matter as long as CI can access it and your server can access your repo. As for CI, I just take CircleCI as an example here because it's pretty neat. In your Git repo, of course, and there are some requirements that you need for each of those parts. And for CI, if we go back, these are CIs that Docksal currently supports. You might not know it because there is no comprehensive documentation of getting you from point A to point B, of creating sandbox environments with Docksal. This documentation is currently in works. This should be released with the next version of Docksal, but all this is currently supported. It works if you know how to use it, and there are examples. They are just scattered everywhere because Docksal is many parts, so they are scattered between documentation for those parts. Okay, so setting up sandboxes. Repo. First, you need your repo to be Git repo. And it should be accessible, obviously, from your Sandboxes server because it has to pull the code from that repo. And that repo should be either accessible to the Sandboxes server without any authentication. Maybe it's inside your network and you don't need any authentication because of that. If it's outside your network, of course you need authentication, but that should be SSH key because you don't want to actually store username and password inside your continuous integration environments. Then you need to set up the Sandboxes server. And frankly speaking, this is the hardest part. It will take you probably an hour even if you know what you're doing, it will take you an hour. For the first time, it will probably take you several hours. So first, it should be a Linux box. For Docksal, it should be Ubuntu Linux. And a lot of people ask, do you support other Linux distributions? And the answer, it's complicated. Any Debian controlled, or any distributions that use Debian packaging system are supported. But there is a part that they differ on, and this is network setup. And we automated that for Ubuntu, but it's hard to automate it for every possible Debian-derived repository, let's say like Mint. It has a little bit different network setup, so that part is not automated. So if you set up Docksal, it will not work out of the box. You will need to take this additional manual step, but it's all possible. And there's actually a blog post on how to set up Docksal on DigitalOcean. It goes from point A to point B. If you follow it, you can set up your future sandbox or maybe staging or development environment there. Then, of course, you need to set up Docksal, which usually is one-liner, but then some configuration needs to be added on top. You need to set up SSH keys because your sandbox server will have to pull code from the repository by SSH key. Your continuous integration will have to access Sandbox server by SSH, so it needs to have the public key. Then you need to create builds folder and do some other preparational stuff like create user. So there's a lot of minor things you need to take. It's not that hard, but these are like main parts what you need to do. So you have your repo, you have your server. Now you need to connect them with continuous integration. And there is an example of a config for CircleCI that it is a real example. We have our Drupal 8 boilerplate, and we have automation sandboxes for that boilerplate that really work, and they work right now. We test our boilerplate with that. So if you open it, you can sneak peek into a real example of how to do that. I will walk through some major part of that configuration. First, it inherits a Docksal image, which is called CI agent. And I need to take a step back here. All those CI servers, why we can benefit from them is because all of them are Docker-based. Bitbucket pipelines, GitLab pipelines, all of them are Docker-based, as well as Docksal. So that's why that's the major part why we can benefit from it. So we created this special CI agent image that has utilities that help you create sandboxes. So first we derive from it. Then there will be steps like check out the code, which I omitted here because they are obvious, and I just jumped to the main step that does the deployment of bugs, and it only has 2 lines. If you did CI, if any of you did continuous integration before, you know it actually takes a lot of lines to log into server, to pull the code for a proper branch, for a proper repo, because that single Sandboxes server can serve for dozens of projects that you have. So you need to pull a certain one. And it only has 2 lines because built in it is a binary that is present in the CI agent image. What it does, it initializes the sandbox for you. It pulls in the code in the right place for the right directory for the right branch. And then you use the same init automation that you created for your local, but it will run on Sandbox and do exactly the same. Create containers, move settings, compile CSS. So this is a huge reuse from what you would do, and you cannot really set up sandboxes without that automation. So if you ever think about doing sandboxes, you cannot feed docx file to it, right? You need to give it some code. Yes, so this is an overview of where Docksal helps you. Again, you need to take many steps to do that, but here you reuse a lot from what you did on your local on the CI. And you can set up it completely in a completely custom way if your organization does not allow using CircleCI or any public continuous integration tools. After the build finished, the CI agent actually is capable of integrating with GitHub or Bitbucket or Slack. What it means is that in GitHub and Bitbucket you will see the build status. As you see from Travis CI, you'll see whether it passed or failed. Or it can send notification to a Slack group that you need. And again, all of that is baked in. You set up some environment variables, like define sandbox host, define Bitbucket credentials, not username and password obviously, but API token that you need to create upfront. But you define them and then you can use them. But you do not need to write all that. It's already there. There's some bonus for CI enthusiasts. Some people use CI a lot, and CI server is not unlimited. If you have 3 projects and you have several developers working on them, chances are you already have a dozen of sandboxes on that CI server. And paying a lot for hardware is not what you look for. So ideally you would, and you don't need those sandboxes after you check them. So there are actually settings that again are not documented yet, but is right there, available there at this time. And it will be documented with all that documentation that's coming on the CI. But these settings tell Docksal to shut down sandboxes after certain periods of inactivity and wipe out sources completely, saving you hard disk space. So you can really have one modest continuous integration server, not too big, running a lot of projects because Docksal is able to shut down unused ones. And the good part is, just imagine it shut down your sandbox in 30 minutes, and then in 1 hour you need it. The good part is when you actually access it, if it's still there, if it did not hit the dangling timeout and did not remove the code completely, if it's still there, it will respawn that sandbox on demand. You'll still able to access it until it completely removes it on the dangling timeout. This is how it will look in the Docksal env. I do not use these settings on your local because some people were using them on your local, and this is a potentially harmful operation because it will delete your sources. If you don't use your project on your local, you can wipe your sources. Some people were experimenting on your local, forgot to remove them, and got their sources deleted. Okay, thank you for your attention. This is chat in Gitter where you can ask questions. I encourage you to visit blog Docksal.io. We have a lot of articles on how to set up Docksal, best practices, because some people come to chat and ask questions that are actually pretty good described in some use case articles on blog. This is our Twitter. If you subscribe to it, it will tell you about events or releases. I guess this is it from me for today. We're actually a little bit, we have more time than I expected. So, any questions?
Yeah, I got two. And I heard your disclaimer about Linux flavors. But I'm curious to know if I can work with this on a CentOS Red Hat 7 box. You're showing Ubuntu and you mentioned Debian having its network issues, but I think CentOS is probably more of a generic flavor of that. So can I use this for
Yes.
Red Hat 7?
Yes, but you would need to set it up almost manually. But again,
But once it's done,
once it's done, you can work with. You would need to set up Docker manually,
Yep.
and then we have a one-liner for Linux. It will work fine if it finds that your Docker is installed. It will not try to reinstall it, because if it tried, it would fail because it would try to use that package, which would not work on CentOS. But if you have it installed, it will find it's installed Docksal, which is basically an automation around Docker. And then there is one part, what is described in this article. So in the Installing Docksal in DigitalOcean article, it is described how to set up so your server would accept connections from outside. So there is a network interface 192.168.64.100 that you would have to set up manually, but that is it basically.
And my second question, I'm a Drupal 7 guy who wants to go to Drupal 8. But your CircleCI example looked like it was specific to Drupal 8. Is it backward compatible? Is there something for Drupal 7 that will help me with that?
Okay, sorry for the confusion. This is just an example, and it is not specific to Drupal 8.
Okay.
What it does, at the end of the day, it runs fininit. And fininit is completely out of our control. It's your command, whatever you do there, whether it's Drupal 7 or even Node.js.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
Yep.
So, how do you get, like, let's say somebody passes all the tests and then you have like, okay, this is what we want to push to production. So how do you make that connection from your local to, is that just, through like the GitHub, apply master to whatever is in production? Or is there something that pushes a database or anything?
That's a great question. So some production is not the part that Docksal currently covers. There is no production-ready containers. Despite some people for lighter sites do install Docksal on their production servers, but this is not something we tested thoroughly. So what you should do is you should look on what your production will look like. Let's say it's achekulaev or it's Pantheon. You know ahead of time what PHP, Apache, and stuff will be there, and you can prepare your Docksal YAML to mirror that infrastructure, those versions. But after you've finished with the development, with your local, with your tests, production is actually like in outer space. You are prepared to that outer space because you trained in the conditions of the outer space, but it's out of the Docksal control. Though it's a good question because some people ask, and we are currently working. It's not progressing too fast, but some people want some utilities to be able to push to production, like let's say achekulaev. And for Pantheon, you can actually do that already. In our last release, we have coupled with Pantheon. It has terminus, like fin terminus command. And
so you have a Docker image with terminus in it?
Yes, CLI has terminus in it.
Oh, okay.
And you can run terminus like fin terminus. And to configure terminus, you pass an environment variable with your secrets. For CLI, you can set them globally or for your project, and terminus will work. It will use those environment variables to connect to your instances. So for Pantheon, you can already automate and push even directly from local to your prod, which I wouldn't really encourage because you should do stage to prod. But, but you can. For achekulaev, it's harder because they don't have terminus thing. We're thinking about doing some custom thing, but of course that's harder than having an official tool like Pantheon has.
Would you recommend CircleCI over Jenkins or TeamCity to do this?
To do your automation? It's just an example, you know. From my experience, I actually used Bitbucket pipelines more than I use CircleCI. I find them more simple than CircleCI. CircleCI is definitely more enterprise grade ready, but for 90 or 80% of the projects, they're actually lighter. And if you host your code on Bitbucket, you get them almost not for free, but for cheap. And they're very convenient. I haven't tried GitLab pipelines a lot. They were introduced recently, but
I'll use Bitbucket, but I may use Jenkins. But I like what you were showing about CircleCI.
yeah, some people do their. That's why I mentioned custom CI server there. So because
I just want the developer to say, I want this on my sandbox. I don't want them to have to worry about typing command after command line.
Right. And what's good about these CI solutions is that you can reuse our CI agent image. With Jenkins, you would have to do it all yourself.
Yeah. Well, we do. We actually use terminus too.
Okay.
So that custom CI server and the connections between the Docksal sandboxes and that. So, you know, those are obviously going to the web. So that custom CI server could be like a self-hosted thing on your network.
Yes, this is the idea.
And so then the hard part of using CentOS for the Ubuntu flavor that you were saying is the network connection. You just have to define that explicitly versus what if you're going to your custom CI server versus one of these things.
Well, when you set up your sandbox server, you need to install Docksal. When you install Docksal, on Ubuntu is a one-liner. Okay. curl-l get Docksal.io. Boom, it installs. One of install steps is creating a a locally binned network interface with IP address 192.168.64.100. This part is unique to every distribution. So on CentOS, it will fail to create that network interface, but it's usually 1 or 2 commands. You just figure them out for your distribution. You do that, you're done. And you can actually open that Fin utility. It's a bash script, so you can open it and see how it tries to. There is a Ubuntu install function. You can scan through it and see what it tries to do. And that's a great, I guess, because we don't hide anything. You can easily modify it or even raise a pull request.
And all this is in the Docksal YAML eventually?
Which?
When you do fin init, that's after this slide or before? So you do fin init to...
For CI, it's complicated. Yeah, that's...
Okay.
Yeah, that's...
You do it every time.
For CI, you set up this, but fin init is performed by your CI solution. When you're on your local, you check out sources and you do fin init. When you are doing CI, you need something to check out sources for you and something to run fin init. And that's what CI is doing. It's like having a robot to log into your PC doing checkout of certain branch and fin init in that branch. And that's what these are. The robots that can do that.
Oh, okay. So they'll say fin init in this build.
Yeah,
this build.
fin init is part of this CI build.
Okay.
Because if it works locally for you, it will work for the robot performing it on some Linux box.
And is there?
CI is complicated now.
No, I dig it. Is there a way to easily, let's say you have a production server and then they say, just copy this. Is there anything that says, okay, these are the settings, you just have to do that manually and then build your Docksal base container based off of that? So, whatever, like you might have Apache 2.2, but then they also have 7.0 for PHP.
Okay.
So can you easily take a snapshot of that somewhere, or you just have to manually build that because you
define those as variables.
Okay, yeah.
Often you don't even need to create that YAML file. With Docker Compose, you would have to describe it in a compose file, like image Docksal/CLI Docksal/web Apache 2.2 or Apache 2.4. But because we have those conventions, we have so-called Docksal env file where you can define environment variables. And if you define web image environment variable, you can just define it there and it will override the default one. So you have Apache 2.2, you say, okay, web image is going to be Docksal web Apache 2.2.
Okay.
PHP, you say CLI image is going to be Docksal CLI 2.1 PHP 5 or PHP 7 or PHP 7.1. Again, 2 lines, it will override the default ones.
Okay.
So it's manual, but it's just a tiny amount of work. Yeah. And all that because there is a central, if you're familiar with Docker Compose, files can inherit one another. You can actually say Docker Compose to use several Compose files, and what it will do, it will merge them one on top of another. And that's what we use. There is a central storage of those Compose files, we call them stacks, in your home folder, home/.docksal. We have several of them. And default one is used by default. If you don't specify anything, you just create .docksal folder in your project and say, Docksal, start my project. It will tell you, all right, I will just start with the default stack. You don't even need to specify anything. If you specify something, it will try to merge them on top of the default stack. All right. Any more questions?
We have your phone number?
I encourage you to, if you have any questions in the future, to actually go into chat. We have a community of guys. Yeah, we have a community of guys, and we visit it often, and there is also a community of guys who know how to solve regular problems. Alrighty, thank you so much.